Hey everybody, how's it going? So it appears that one of the tools in fighting COVID in indoor spaces appears to be almost as useless as indoor dining. This is an interesting article here. This is not from a conspiracy website. This is from the New York Times. It says these anti-COVID barriers probably don't help and make things worse. And you may have seen when you walk into certain stores that they put up these giant walls of plastic that are supposed to be able to block a virus from getting from you to you. One of the things that I find interesting about these in particular is anytime I see one of these, usually the person behind it has the mask on their chin rather than over their mouth. So this picture is actually a rare one for me because almost every time I've gone into a place with this, the person behind it has the mask on their chin. And B, what usually winds up happening is because people don't like or they're not used to looking at someone through plastic, what they'll do is they'll sidestep the plastic barrier so that they could talk to the person directly. And often it's not just the customer doing this, it's actually the person that works there who's the employee who these barriers were put up for the purposes of protecting. So I thought I would just read this article and give you some thoughts. It says, shields at a restaurant in Placerville, California in May 2020. Research suggests that transparent barriers interfere with normal ventilation. Almost the same way that indoor dining interferes with logic. COVID precautions have turned many parts of our world into a giant salad bar with plastic barriers separating sales clerks from shoppers, dividing customers at nail salons and shielding students from their classmates. Intuition tells us a plastic shield will be protective against germs, but scientists who study aerosols, airflow, and ventilation say that much of the time the barriers don't help and probably give people a false sense of security. And sometimes the barriers can make things worse. So we just talked about that with the false sense of security, which is, again, I'll go to so many delis that have this thing on. It says must wear a mask. And the moment you walk into the deli and you look at the cashier, they have the little plastic barrier and mask is solidly censoring their chin. Research suggests that in some instances, a barrier protecting a clerk behind a checkout counter may redirect the germs to another worker or customer. Rows of clear plastic shields, like those you might find in a nail salon or classroom, can also impede normal airflow and ventilation. Under normal conditions in stores, classrooms, and offices, exhaled breath particles disperse, carried by air currents, and, depending on the ventilation system, are replaced by fresh air roughly every 15 to 30 minutes. But erecting plastic barriers can change airflow in a room, disrupt normal ventilation, and create dead zones, where viral aerosol particles can build up and become highly concentrated. If you have a forest of barriers in a classroom, it's going to interfere with proper ventilation of that room, said Lindsay Marr, professor of civil and environmental engineering at Virginia Tech and one of the world's leading experts in viral transmission. Everybody's aerosols are going to be trapped and stuck there and building up, and they will end up spreading beyond your own desk. Now, one of the things that I brought up with the indoor dining scenario, which you could just search this channel, I've made videos on that topic, is that what you wind up happening, you had a restaurant that had windows and a door, and rather than just open the windows of the restaurant or the door of the restaurant to let air in and maybe put a fan by it, what you have now is you build a structure on the street that has no ventilation at all. You have windows and a door on it, so it's unventilated. So it's actually worse than the real inside because it's completely inside, just outside. And this is one of the things that you get here where you try to do something that you think is going to work that probably makes companies like Uline or every other company that's selling these BS plastic barriers a lot of money. Because I see these things at every deli. I see these things all over B&H Photo. They probably spent a good amount of money on it, and it's actually not helping you at all. There are some situations in which the clear shields might be protective, but it depends on a number of variables. The barriers can stop big droplets ejected during coughs and sneezes from splattering on others, which is why buffets and salad bars are often equipped with transparent sneeze guards above the food. And for that purpose, by all means, I like the idea of them being above food so that you can't sneeze on it or cough on it or anything like that, but there you're looking to avoid, giant droplets of your own spit rather than a virus. But COVID-19 spreads largely through unseen aerosol particles. While there isn't much real-world research on the impact of transparent barriers and the risk of disease, scientists in the United States and Britain have begun to study the issue, and the findings are not reassuring. A study published in June, led by researchers from Johns Hopkins, for example, showed that desk screens in classrooms were associated with an increased risk of coronavirus infection, your property taxes at work. In a Massachusetts school district, researchers found that plexiglass dividers with sidewalls in the main office were impeding airflow. A study looking at schools in Georgia found that desk barriers had little effect on the spread of COVID compared with ventilation improvements and masking. Before the pandemic, a study published in 2014 found that office cubicle dividers were among the factors that may have contributed to disease transmission during a tuberculosis outbreak in Australia. British researchers have conducted modeling studies simulating what happens when a person on one side of a barrier, like a customer in a store, exhales particles while speaking or coughing under various ventilation conditions. The screen is more effective when the person coughs because the larger particles have greater momentum and hit the barrier. But when a person speaks, the screen does not trap the exhaled particles, which just float around. While the store clerk may avoid an immediate and direct hit, the particles are still in the room, posing a risk to the clerk and others who may inhale the contaminated air. We have shown this effect of blocking larger particles, but also that the smaller aerosols travel over the screen and become mixed in the room air within about 5 minutes, says Catherine Noakes, professor of environmental engineering for buildings at the University of Leeds in England. This means that if people are interacting for more than a few minutes, they would likely be exposed to the virus regardless of the screen. Dr. Noakes said erecting barriers may seem like a good idea but can have unintended consequences. She conducted a study published in 2013 that looked at the effect of partitions between beds in hospitals. The study showed that while some people were protected from germs, the partitions funneled the air in the room toward others. So while a worker behind a transparent barrier might be spared some of a customer's germs, a worker nearby or customers in the line could still be exposed. Dr. Noakes said most screens she has seen are poorly positioned and unlikely to be of much benefit. And this is one of those cases where you have something that really isn't that effective as is, but only gets you that really minimal level of effectiveness if you're using it perfectly, which is just fundamentally not the way this is going to be set up by people whose job is not to, figure out how to stop a virus from spreading. If your job is to run a hardware store, a bodega, you're probably putting that there because you want to make it look like to the city that you're being responsible so that you don't have your business shut down, your livelihood destroyed. At the end of the day, that's probably why many of these places are buying this stuff and putting the signs in the window, because they don't want their business and livelihood destroyed. And I don't blame them, but we should be real about the fact that this is not doing much. To understand why screens often have little effect on protecting people from aerosol particles, it helps to think about exhaled breath like a plume of cigarette smoke, Dr. Marr said. One way to think about plastic barriers is that they are good for blocking things like spitballs, but ineffective for things like cigarette smoke, Dr. Marr said. The smoke simply drifts around them, so they will give the person on the other side a little more time before being exposed to the smoke. Meanwhile, people at the same side with the smoker will be exposed to more smoke since the barriers trap it on that side until it has a chance to mix throughout the space. Most researchers say that the screens most likely help in very specific situations. A bus driver, for instance, shielded from the public by a floor-to-ceiling barrier, is probably protected from inhaling much of what passengers are exhaling. A bank cashier behind a wall of glass or a clerk checking in patients in a doctor's office may be at least partially protected by a barrier. A study by researchers with the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health in Cincinnati tested different-sized transparent barriers in an isolation room using a cough simulator. The study, which hasn't yet been peer-reviewed, found that under the right conditions, taller shields above cough height stopped about 70% of particles from reaching the particle counter on the other side, which is where the store or salon worker would be sitting or standing. But the study's authors noted the limitations of the research, particularly that the experiment was conducted under highly controlled conditions. The experiment took place in an isolation room with consistent ventilation rates that didn't accurately reflect all real-world situations, the report said. Again, the big thing here, didn't accurately reflect all real-world situations. Many of these ideas have the potential to work when implemented by an expert, and that's just fundamentally not how many of these ideas are going to be implemented in reality when you are talking about your corner store, your bodega, or your hardware store. The study didn't consider that workers and customers move around, that other people could be in the room breathing the redirected particles, and that many stores and classrooms have several stations with acrylic barriers, not just one, that impede normal airflow. While further research is needed to determine the effect of adding transparent shields around school or office desks, all the aerosol experts interviewed agreed that desk shields were unlikely to help and were likely to interfere with the normal ventilation of the room. Depending on the conditions, the plastic shields could cause viral particles to accumulate in the room. If there are aerosol particles in the classroom air, those shields around the students won't protect them, said Richard Corsi, the incoming Dean of Engineering at the University of California, Davis. Depending on the airflow conditions in the room, you can get a downdraft into those little spaces that you're now confined in and cause particles to concentrate in your space. Aerosol scientists say schools and workplaces should focus on encouraging workers and eligible students to be vaccinated, improving ventilation, adding HEPA, air filtering machines when needed, and imposing mask requirements, all of which are proven ways to reduce virus transmission. The problem, experts say, is that most of the people in charge of erecting barriers in office, restaurants, nail salons, and schools are not doing so with the assistance of engineering experts who can evacuate airflow and ventilation for each room. Yes, true. Again, the same thing seems to be true for mask mandates. As I've said on this channel many times and gotten much shit for since last May, I have absolutely no problem with wearing a mask prior to me getting vaccinated. I had no issue with it at all. Is it perfect? No. Is it better than nothing? Yes. But the issue that I had when it came to mask mandates is masks may work, mandates don't. So, for instance, I was recently in Vegas for a convention. It was the Prepaid Wireless Expo. I was a speaker on a panel regarding right to repair, and I had a table where I could have people come by and talk about right to repair. I entered the Caesars Palace, and there's a sign that says mask must be worn inside the space. And there was a gentleman who was handing out masks to people who don't have them, who is enforcing the mask mandate with his mask over here. Not here. Here. Now I walk up to the other floor where they're having the convention. This guy is ensuring that everybody who walks in has a mask. He's telling them that they need a mask to enter, as their mask sits over here. So I can see half of his upper lip and his full nose. You see what I'm getting at here. At the end of the day, even if something actually works, the mandate for it may not because of what happens in reality. Like, I see many stores in New York City, and if I see pre-vaccine, I always had a mask on as long as I was walking around other people, just because it was the right thing to do at the time, in my opinion, based on, it's a really low price for me to pay to avoid potentially spreading it to somebody else. I would see on these stores, it would say, little sign, mask required to enter. And then I would look in, and 90% of the time, the employees and the owner of the deli had a chin bra. The sign is there because it has to be there, but is it working? Masks may work, but does the mandate work? If the mandate doesn't work without strict enforcement, then who's going to be the strict enforcer? And is that going to be the type of person that you want around? If you can't enforce that people take a mask and wear it over their nose, then how are you going to enforce when you put barriers up that people stand behind them? If at your deli or if at your hardware store there's a barrier and your customer moves to the side of the barrier so that they can hear you better, are you going to tell them to get out of your store if they don't go back behind the barrier? There's so many micro conflicts inherent in enforcing something like this that most people that I see that work in these locations have long since given up on. There are there's stores that I've went to where I see they have all these plastic barriers in them, and they're all just carted off to the side. Because you'll walk in and you'll see that, an employee they won't be able to hear a customer, or they feel weird speaking behind the barrier because they're not adjusted to it, so they'll just walk around it, which then begs the question, why is this barrier there? And if this is so fatal, if this is something that is such a horrible illness, then why would you risk getting it by moving to the side of the barrier just so that you could better see a customer or an employee of that store that you're probably not going to see ever again? People shouldn't panic when they see transparent barriers, but they shouldn't view them as fully protective either. Workers and students who have transparent shields around them should continue to wear a mask to lower risk, Dr. Corsi said. Airflow in rooms is pretty complicated, Dr. Corsi said. Every room is different in terms of the arrangement of the furniture, the height of the walls and ceilings, the vents, where the bookshelves are. All these things have a huge impact on the airflow and the air distribution in a room because every classroom or office space is different. And to me, this seems like a bunch of security theater. Also a really, really good way to make some good money if you're actually selling these things. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. That's for today. And as always, hope you learned something. Say bye, Mr. Clinton.